what Tantra has to do with shadow work, because I think a lot of people don't really know how those two parts are connected. So why do you think is shadow work part of Tantra?
Yeah. Well, let's start with defining shadow work. Um, for me and everybody that has been on a spiritual path, at a certain point you realize, okay, fluffing up the shiny parts works to a certain extent. If you really
Mm.
feel shit and you have really shitty thoughts, then you might restructure the thought patterns in your head to have a little bit more shiny uh, thoughts.
Mm.
But that's only a part of the puzzle. And I like what Jung said about it. Carl Gustav Jung, one of the uh, pioneers in this field of depth psychology and of shadow work per se. He said you don't become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by also looking into the shadow sides, into the darker parts. So what does he mean with that? And I think uh, every spiritual path, with Tantra included, longs to accept the whole of life. Not only not only want to be happy when the weather is good, we also want to have a sense of contentment and deep acceptance when the weather is shitty and when we are, uh, yeah, not living our picture perfect life.
Mhm.
So in shadow work, we dive into the parts that we normally don't like to see.
Mhm.
Our anger, our jealousy, our lust, our rage, our fear,
Mm.
those parts. So that's shadow work is about that, accepting all these parts.
Mm.
Um,
And I think for most people, this is a little bit scary, right? Because we are taught that we cannot have these emotions, or like what you said, like lust, anger, like all of these experiences, that these are forbidden experiences.
mhm. Yeah,
And
exactly.
that's why they get into the shadow, right? Because we don't want to see them.
Exactly, exactly.
And
S-
why do you think it's so hard for people to find out what kind of shadows they have?
yeah, precisely because of the mechanism that you described. So it's also important to know that nothing goes wrong with creating a shadow. That's part of life of human development.
Yes.
Because what happens when we are young little boys and girls, our parents they like certain parts, like
Mm.
when you're a good boy or a good girl, and they dislike other parts when you're very angry and you hit your brother with a
Yeah.
stick. So very natural to just gain love and gain security. We present those likable parts forward, and
Mm.
we try to hide uh, the parts that we don't like so much, or our parents or our upbringers don't like so much.
Mm.
And
Mm.
sometimes we hide it so far that we forget we have it. We
Yes.
totally split off from them, as it seems.
Yes.
And that's why it's so difficult to discover what are the parts that are in the shadow.
Yeah. And how, like, what people often ask me is like, how do you work with shadows? Like, how do you bring them to light? And can you say something about how we bring shadow to light in Tantra?
Yeah, yeah. So the question is first, like, get to know your shadow material. What did I repress? But before we dive into that question, maybe briefly address why would we want to
Yeah.
dive into our shadow? And for me, that's an essential question because uh, there is so much strength hidden in the shadow.
Mhm.
And imagine for example, if you repressed anger because you want to be nice and soft and gentle, do you know what strength is in anger? You know
Yeah.
what vitality is there? Or if
So
you
much.
repressed your sexuality, what
Mm.
what aliveness is there?
Mhm.
So I'm interested in getting all those raw raw sides on the table so I can live from the full potential of it. That
Yes.
makes life more interesting.
Yeah.
Um,
So.
and how do you do that? How do you discover what
Mhm.
hidden sources you have repressed? A good one is shame. Often we feel ashamed about the parts we hide because we feel like, oh, I hope I try to hide it successfully, but maybe somebody finds out. Maybe somebody finds out that I'm on the surface maybe presenting as a not so sexual being, but
Mm.
actually I have all this lusts for the colleague in the next desk or
Yeah.
the girl next door or whatever. So when somebody points that out, you feel ashamed. You
Yeah.
feel exposed. So
Yes.
shame is a good one.
Hmm.
Often in my workshops, that's one of the first questions. I ask people to take a piece of paper and write down, uh, if you really would know me and would know the sides of me where I'm ashamed about, what would you know about me? Just to explore it a little.
Mm-hmm.
So shame is one part. Another part is a projection. And with
Yeah.
projection, we mean it's a mechanism in the psyche when we repress certain parts. For example, my aliveness. I
Yeah.
actually like to dance and be the center of attention, but I split off from that because my parents didn't like it
Yeah.
back in the days. What will happen then when I'm on a party and somebody else takes the stage and dances wildly, and I will probably feel irritated or like,
Yeah.
ah, fuck, it's such a show off, and she
Yeah.
just does it to get attention, and ah, how pathetic.
Mhm.
That
Yeah.
mechanism is called projection.
Yeah.
So a second interesting exercise would be write down all the stuff that you find super irritating about other people.
Yeah.
Explore, might it be true that some of those things are actually things you would like to do for yourself, but are not don't
Yes.
have the courage for it.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
so those are two ways to easily get started with
Yeah.
shadow work, I think.
So it's mostly about finding out the shadows, because what is easy for people to understand, I guess, like when you have shadows and as soon as you bring them to consciousness, you already bring light to them, and then they're already not in your shadow anymore, right?
Yeah,
Shadow just means that we don't know it because it's in the unconscious. So
yeah,
as soon, because yeah, sometimes they ask like what kind of practices, but this is actually it, like getting to know what is in the unconscious, right? To get it.
exactly. Yeah, getting to know what's
And
in the unconscious.
exactly. And one other very interesting thing is, I think, for example, when we talk about lust, what you just said, like, okay, I find this girl from next door attractive and I find this girl attractive, like, and I think like a lot of people think as soon as they get into this shadow or like into shame of that, or like accepting these impulses, then they will lose themselves,
Mm-hmm.
you
Yeah,
know. I think that's a big fear when we are working with shadows.
yeah. Can I
So
ask you if you have that for yourself?
no, but I have some, like, those
I don't
people.
believe you.
No, actually, like, when I did, I mean, I did a lot of shadow work as well, and I think that was my fear in the beginning, especially
Mm,
with hair and as a woman, right? So I know that sometimes when we have these shadows, it's like, yeah, I know I have it, but I don't want to really go into it because then uh, it could, like, you could explode or something.
mhm.
You're just like there's a lot of fear of like losing the self
Mm,
in the emotion.
yeah.
I know
Do you
that.
have an example?
Yeah, for example, I think for men, because I work a lot with men, it's a lot the case that they say, yeah, okay, but if I go into my sexual shadow side, into my animal, then I might hurt woman.
Mhm. So if
You know?
I step into this raw animalistic, I
Yeah,
wanna grab and penetrate and
yeah,
ravish, then I will hurt women.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So that's the fear you say when people
That's
dive into those raw sides. Yeah,
yeah,
and that might be true, right?
yeah,
So how do we navigate that?
yeah. So I mean, the thing is, what I think what is really beautiful about Tantra is because we also work on our focus and our concentration, right? And our discipline. That's something which is really interesting in Tantra, because people think it's like really sensation based, but it's really it has a lot to do with being very disciplined and focused.
Mm,
If you do shadow work with your lust, with your sexual urges, you actually start to observe them, right?
mm,
Don't go blindly after them, but you allow them.
yes. Yeah. So
And I,
it's
yeah,
about containment then, you say.
yeah,
So feeling the full lust,
yeah,
how badly you want it,
yeah.
maybe
And
express it
also
a little
enjoy
bit.
it. It's something so beautiful, right? If you
Mm,
can feel this intensity in your body without having to be guided by it.
yes. Yeah. And I think that's a critical notion that you make there. That the difference between lust or anger in its destructive or in its healthy form is the level of awareness you have with it and the capacity to hold it. So
Exactly.
in the work we do, we in the tradition we say we become like a hollow bamboo that is first
Yes.
very thin and then it's getting wider and wider and wider so that the whole fullness of the emotion can rage to your system
Yeah.
without being swept away.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's something you describe, right? That when you
Yes.
feel your animalistic lust and your sexual drive, it's very overwhelming and even potentially dangerous for yourself, but especially the people around you
Mm.
when you're overwhelmed by it and when
Yeah.
you are almost like a victim or enslaved. If you have
Yeah.
a blind rage, when you're so
Yes.
angry and you can't stop.
Yes. Yeah.
And sometimes, and that's where in workshops and retreat, we create safe containers for that to go into this blind, but then everybody knows what we're doing.
Yeah.
But in daily life, we try to enlarge that containment capacity so that we can feel the fullness of the sensation, but
Yeah.
hold it.
Yes. Yes. And I think that's a really important part when we talk about shadow work and allowing all of your emotions. Yes. But then also using your consciousness to hold it. Right.
Exactly. Yeah. So these
So
two things go hand in hand, I would say. Access to the raw emotions and the capacity to hold it.
yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And when we talk about sexuality, it's very often that Tantra in general is connected with sexuality, especially in the Western countries. So that's also what brings a lot of people to Tantra with the idea of becoming better in sexual activities. So, why do you think is Tantra so popular or like so connected to sexuality in a lot of minds?
Mm.
Oh,
Yeah. Well, I think it says something about the need that is there. And in my coaching practice, I see that as well. There's a dire need for deeper connection, also in life, but also in the sexual field.
yeah.
So I think it's not so much that tantra brought sexuality to the Western, but it's almost like the West was looking for something that could deepen their sexuality. And
Yeah.
then came in the 60s when the first people came back from India with experiences from this tradition. They almost cherry picked a little bit. Like
Yeah.
Tantra is such a vast tradition.
Yeah.
It's a huge stream of yoga with beautiful, deep philosophy, and most really most of the practices in my part of the neck of
Mm,
the woods, at least in my lineage I practice with, you
mhm.
practice individually. So
Yeah.
it's all about opening the energy body, working with mantras, with visualizations, and sometimes, and that's only even in the more advanced stages, you connect it with somebody else. So you, for
Mm,
example, I have some energy channels in my system. One of them is the main energy channel, Shushumna Nadi. And it's very
mm.
beautiful to breathe into that, and you feel all sparkly and joyful, and that interesting on your own. But how beautiful is it to connect that with somebody else, and we exchange the energy
Yeah.
there. It's I think the West, what happened is to take only those exercises and sort of run away with it a little bit. So
Yeah.
most of the stuff that we see in tantric festivals and workshops, they not necessarily have much to do with what happened 1,000 years ago in India, And it's not
Yeah.
to say that these practices that we do now are wrong. They serve
Mm.
a great need. It's just that it's not really tantric as much. I
Yeah.
would most of
Yeah.
the work I see around me, and I practice myself as well. I would call it conscious sexuality,
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
And so what we also can see a little bit when we talk about this connection field, that a lot of people always have the tendency to seek for peak experiences,
Hmm.
right? To run from one goal to the other goal. Like now I have to get to this point, and now I have to get to this point, and like how do these peak experiences actually um, do not lead you into fully understanding the tantric practice in the
Yeah.
moment?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question, and it relates to the very first question that you asked, like what is the role of shadow work in tantric yoga or tantric
Yeah.
practice? Because this is exactly what happens if you start practicing tantric yoga, is that you will have all sorts of wonderful experiences. Your head will open up. You might feel one with the universe. You want feel one field of sizzling bliss. That's all very beautiful, but what is the use of that,
Mm.
what is the added value for that in
Yeah.
as a human being? Because um, what happens after you have this experience? You go back to your baseline state.
Yeah.
um, and what can happen in tantra is that you just get addicted to those states. It feels so good, you want to get back to it, and you want to deepen them, and you want to have them more intense, and you want to have them every day. So you go from workshop to workshop to workshop and retreat to retreat, and you have
Yes.
the wildest sexual adventures, and you have multiple lovers, and you want to have it all. But
Hmm.
what is the freedom in that? It's very
Yes.
alive through that. It's very alive. But where's the freedom? And
Mm.
isn't not true that you're just swapping one addiction? Or for example, maybe for example, was first. It was all about earning money,
Mm.
creating interesting companies that have an impact on the world. So I would
Mm.
be invited to the in most interesting stages to talk about what an interesting guy I was. That was
Yeah.
one addiction, and now I was swapping it for an addiction to these peak experiences in spiritual practice and tantra. Um, so I like Ramdas, one of my inspiration, uh,
Mhm.
uh, Harvard professor turned mystic, and he
Mhm.
likes to say, yeah, well, getting high is not the problem. Getting high
Yeah.
is not the problem. It is about what is the baseline of my happiness.
Yeah.
Um, and that's the role of shadow work. So without shadow work, uh, spiritual practice, but tantra per se, because it's so powerful,
Mhm.
has a big tendency to become addictive, and then
Yes.
you narrow your world more and more and more. It's more
Mm.
about yeah, filling this inner void, trying to fill this inner void with stuff, with external stuff. And
Yeah.
even though those experiences are more refined, maybe than buying a new car or a bigger house or so, it's still an external something that you try to fill up your inner void with. And
Yes.
I'm interested not in bigger things to fill that hole
Yeah.
with, but how can I get free? How
Yes.
can I get free of the need to feel that void?
Yes.
And that's where shadow work comes in.
Yeah. So you would say, like, for those who listen right now, that when you work on your shadows, you become full from the inside, and then you're not addicted to peak experiences, whatever it is from the outside.
Yeah, or at least the importance you attribute to it
Yes.
softens. So you still can have this exactly the same experiences, but you see that it is not the goal of the path to have peak experiences after peak
Enjoy it
experience.
as part of it, but you're not addicted to it.
Exactly, yeah. The tradition, I like that as well. They see it as gems on the path. Like
Yeah.
you're walking up, and sometimes you find something beautiful. And
Yeah.
it's also not to say that the 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 height of your peak says something about your spiritual development or so.
Mhm.
It's it's not so interesting what the height of your peak is. It's interesting what is the normal level of openness, of acceptance,
Yeah, I think
of
that's really
love that is
yeah.
in your heart, in the supermarket. You know?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that's a big topic because everybody's looking for a better teacher, for a better practice, for better this, that. And then it's all about like how are you in every moment, right?
Yeah,
That's what the real practice is.
yeah.
And yeah, I wanted to say, oh yeah, what I also wanted to say, when I say like filling the void, it seems like, okay, like after a certain point, you're done. But this is really not true, right? So we will always find new shadows because we are so
Hmm.
amazingly uh, layered that we will never be done, right? Like it's like a path that we can just, it's not that, okay, now I have to do this and that, and then after that I'm done with my work. So
Yeah,
I think this whole the filling the void and becoming fuller and more free is an ongoing path. And I think that's also really important to understand that you don't have to be done.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. And who knows? Maybe one day you're done. I
One
don't
day,
know. I think the
yeah,
Buddha was
yeah,
done. Jesus
yeah,
was done.
yeah,
I have no clue. But what I hear you say is that we have this hope sometimes that if only
yes,
I could do this practice or go on this retreat or sit with this teacher or do
yes,
this therapy, then I would be
yeah,
healed.
yeah,
Um, but yeah, and I'm fully with you there that this is it's a self-perpetuating story because then you are maybe you heal a little bit and then there's a new horizon with stuff that can be healed and
yeah,
um, so sometimes especially in the west driven by the whole self-help industry and that
hmm,
earns its money by saying hey there's a problem with you here's the solution
yes,
can we sometimes accept that hey there's parts of us that need to be healed or that
yes,
long for healing
yes,
and there's part of us which are absolutely fine so can we hold and accept um, accept the little wrinkles and
yeah,
dents that we have and scratches that we have
yeah,
and that life doesn't begin as soon as I'm healed no
exactly,
it's already happening
yes,
and in a way yeah healing is just the most interesting thing a man can do or a woman can do that's also it's okay this might be very radical but it's almost like the best hobby or so you know
yeah,
no
yeah,
that's not the best it's natural for a
yeah,
soul to long for healing
yeah.
it's natural
And what I also imagine sometimes, what I find really beautiful, that we have to be like grown up with all of these shadows because only through them we get to know ourselves. If we would be healed
mm.
already, then like what would we have to do? Of course we would enjoy, but still it's like something so beautiful to
Hmm.
actually heal and get to know yourself more and heal and get to know yourself more, expand more, right?
Yeah
And
there's a
I think
beauty to
that's
that process
yeah, it's part of the whole meaning of being alive.
yeah
So also maybe not to push it away, but to invite it to see like, oh, I can learn something here.
yeah
Oh, here I can expand a little bit more. And not from a place like I'm not enough yet, but this is just interesting. Like, you know?
yeah.
So yeah. Would you like to say anything? Would you like to add anything more to end this little talk about shadow work and Tantra?
No I feel quite fulfilled feels like we covered it
Yes. It's
um,
beautiful.
I think it's I actually am very happy that the last few years I see more and more crossfading of the worlds of therapy and
Yes.
spirituality because I think
Yes.
spirituality without um, psychotherapy or shadow work can
Mm.
lead to escapism you just
Yes.
are get very very trained to sometimes even dissociate away from the pain and then it
Yes.
feels good as long as you're on your meditation pillow but you actually
Yes.
don't really become a nicer human being and at the
Exactly.
same time therapy without spirituality can lead to endless fixing yourself
Yeah.
loops, like what we
Yes.
just discussed. And
Yes.
you never will fall in a wider, more encompassing field of acceptance. So for me, the interesting field is where these two intersect,
Yes.
because
Yeah.
I'm not a monk, you know, maybe it works in the cave to just focus on the meditation part, but
Mhm.
I want to be a better human being, a better lover, a better father, a better son to my parents. Um,
Yeah.
and that's where I need those two worlds for.
Yes. Beautiful.
Mm.
Thank you so much, Jos, for this conversation.
Yeah, thank you.
And I guess we will continue at some other point with
We
another topic.
will. Thank you, Isabel. It's good to see you again and good to talk.